Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar concerning the Bauervic essay competition. And we'll be discussing the topic of the Bauervic essay competition, which is censorship, fake news, and viewpoint discrimination. What is the role of government versus market forces in enabling free and responsible speech? My name is Michael Van Beek, and I'm the Director of Research at the Mackinac Center, and we're really happy to have you with us. And we hope that through this workshop, you'll learn about how to craft a really well-researched article and essay that you can submit for this competition that you can earn some really great prizes with. And we have an excellent panel to discuss how you can do that. Before we start with the panel, however, a couple things. If you have a question during the course of one of the panelists' presentations or at the end of the session, which will make some time for Q&A then, you can just pop that question into the text box that you should see at the bottom of your screen. And then I'll be able to see those, and I'll ask them of the panelists as we proceed through the presentations. The other thing is Northwood is hosting an event this upcoming Monday, January 23. It's at 7 p.m. and it's in Griswold Lecture Hall. And it is featuring Aaron Turr from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And he's going to be talking about this very issue that you're working on your Bauervic essay on. So that would be a great opportunity for you to learn even more about censorship. And FIRE, the organization that Aaron Turr works for, they file lawsuits against government censorship in lots of different places. So he has firsthand experience of how this issue works and all the different relevant sides to the debate about it. So with that, let me introduce the panelists. First, we're going to start with Charlie Szymanski. Charlie is a third-year student at Northwood and majoring in operations, supply chain, and business management. And maybe more importantly, she was last year's winner of the Bauervic essay competition. So she has lots of valuable insights to provide. After Charlie will be Michael McCovey. He's an assistant professor of economics at Northwood University. And following Michael will be Dale Matchek, who is who's also a professor of economics at Northwood and the chair of the department. And then so after all three panelists present, then we'll have some time for Q&A after that. So Charlie, you can take it from here.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, I'm delighted to participate this evening and share some of my insight on the Bauervic essay as a participant, as a student. And I would like to begin by saying, regardless of your placement in the competition, I think the Bauervic essay is an incredible opportunity. In the past 2 years that I have participated, I have gained a plethora of knowledge on a topic that is extremely relevant to society today. And through the process of writing your essay, this may change your perspective on a topic or even give you a new perspective. So no matter what the outcome is, there is educational value in the essay and you will learn something along the way. Now, in my first year that I participated, I placed third. And I think this ultimately set me up for success last year because it taught me that the first essay I had submitted was not the quality output that was required to be truly competitive in this essay. And so I made some changes last year, and those changes I think contributed to my success, and I would like to share some of those with all of you. My first piece of advice is to start your essay by creating an outline. And I know an outline may seem like tedious, busy work, but I think that my best quality writing comes from an outline. Creating an outline develops a sense of organization, especially for the Bauervic essay. These topics have a level of controversy and division. I think it's very easy to spiral down a rabbit hole and begin a rant, because we are very opinionated about these topics. But by creating an outline, it ensures that we are staying on track and we are focused on the main points of our argument. Now, I think one of the benefits to creating an outline is it shows me which of my points are strong and which points may be a little bit weaker. As I'm developing the content for my essay, I like to follow the 3x3 rule. And I think this is pretty standard by most English teachers, where you have 3 main points with at least 3 supporting details for each of those main points. Now, there is some level of subjectivity here. If you feel you have 2 really strong supporting details, that may be sufficient to support one of those main points. But if you find that you really only have 1 supporting detail for one of your primary arguments, then you may need to do a little bit more research or even revisit that point entirely. By using this setup and viewing it in an outline format, it can also tell me from a visual perspective which points look heavier and which points look weaker, so I can ensure that all of my points are equally balanced and are adding value to the essay. I also think that by writing an outline, the writing process becomes easier. I already have my content decided upon. I know what my next step is. I'm not stopping several times in the middle of a paragraph to do more research. And I think that by having the organization up front, knowing what my next point is, I can make more fluid transitions. And I think the writing process is much quicker and much easier by doing this work in advance. Now, the topics that we are asked to write about for the Bauervic essay lend themselves to selecting a viewpoint. And for example, in the essay last year, I chose to support the viewpoint that we should not advocate for vaccine mandates. So you're going to pick a perspective, and you really want to stick to this perspective throughout your entire essay. But I encourage you to really strive to balance your bias and present a more objective argument. If you present your perspective in a very one-sided manner, this will ultimately degrade your credibility. And if you're able to even use some points from the other perspective, even if it's simply to refute them or argue against them, I think it creates more leverage for your argument. And it also shows that you're open-minded, that you're acknowledging the opposite side. And I think that it helps to create a more cohesive, well-thought-out essay. And I think this was one of the strengths of my essay last year, is I really strived to remain neutral and objective. And it also shows that the essay is more backed in research, which we'll get to that research component in just a moment. But by doing that, it shows that you're not, you're looking at all sides of the argument. Now, I think a thesis is very important. That thesis is going to appear towards the conclusion of your first paragraph, as well as at the end of your essay. And this thesis is a clear statement that introduces your topic and the perspective that you are introducing. This thesis, I like to think of it as laying the groundwork for the remainder of your essay. So when you're thinking about your thesis, consider what perspective are you presenting and what are your arguments for that perspective, and create a statement that reflects this, so the reader has a clear understanding of where your essay is headed. I think, in my opinion, one of the most important pieces of the Bauervic essay is the research. Now, in my essay last year, I used 20 sources. Now, I'm not saying that you need to use 20 sources, but I think that research is essential to putting forth a really quality essay. And I think there's value in using a variety of different sources. In my previous essay, I had a mixture of studies, articles, Supreme Court cases. I even cited the United States Constitution. But by pulling sources and pulling information from different locations, having different resources to develop my argument, I think this creates a better argument overall. And it also shows the reader or the judge that the perspective that you are presenting is supported by a well-rounded group of individuals, as well as organizations. I think sometimes it's very tempting to use a Google search engine and find an article that agrees with our viewpoint, and we're tempted to use it just because they think the same way we do. But remember, if you're choosing an article just because it agrees with your viewpoint, it may not necessarily be a quality source. And using these sources that may not be really quality sources is ultimately going to degrade your argument. I would recommend using Google Scholar if you're looking for an easy way to start exploring a little bit more scholarly, high quality sources. And if you're going to take a more of a traditional Google route, there are some things that I like to look for in determining what is a quality source. If you're familiar with APA or MLA formatting, there are certain elements that you're looking for to be able to create your citation. You're looking for an author, a date. There are certain elements that you're looking for to create those citations. And while APA formatting is not required for the Bauervic essay, I think looking for these elements in a source helps to share with me whether or not that source is credible. Every once in a while, you will find an article where the author has cited their sources that they have used to write their piece of writing. And I think these articles in particular are extremely valuable because you can take the sources from that author and dive even deeper to that primary source and try to understand the topic at a deeper level. Now, I encourage you to be creative with your essay. You have some creative liberty here. I think that if you can create a catchy hook, remember, these judges are reading several of these essays and you want to keep the judge engaged while also presenting your content throughout the essay. But I think you're able to maintain a level of professionalism while also incorporating a little bit of your personality, whether that's through a rhetorical question or maybe even a little bit of sarcasm. But if you can do something to enhance the essay and make the writing itself a little bit more unique while supporting your point or placing emphasis on a point, I think that can add value to your essay. And consider how you can make your essay stand out. Is there a perspective that you can take that you don't think is common amongst your peers? For example, in my essay last year, in looking at vaccine mandates, I looked at vaccine mandates throughout history instead of looking at it from an economic or business perspective. So think about different ways that you may be able to explore the topic in a unique manner that your peers may not consider. Well, thank you so much. I would be happy to answer any of your questions in our Q&A session later this evening.
Okay, we can, thanks, Charlie, for that. We can transfer over to Michael, if you want to unmute yourself, and you're up.
Right. So I'm thinking about the kinds of essays I've had students write. And the first thing I would say, some of this will overlap with some of what Charlie said, is make sure you're arguing some specific definite viewpoint. Like a lot of times in high school, what you've been asked to write is a summary of what everyone else says. And what your high school teacher wants to see is that you can read other people and just summarize what they said. That is an extremely important skill, right? Before you can ever express your own opinion, you have to be able to first be able to summarize other people's opinions. So that skill is important, and that's why high school trained you to do that. But that's not what you're being asked to do here. You are supposed to put forth some specific, definite viewpoint of your own. So the reader should come away from your essay saying, I know this essay was trying to convince me of X. It could be, we should pass a law that does such and such, or we should not pass this law that everyone else has been saying we ought to pass. Or your viewpoint could be, everyone else is wrong. I don't know, let's say you don't have a solution to some social problem. You can say, well, the proposed solutions have been A, B, and C. A, B, and C are all wrong because they'll all have unintended consequences of the following sort. They will all fail. We all, as a society, have to research what the correct thing is, and we don't yet know what that is. That's also a viewpoint. But there should be some definite, specific thing that the reader should say, okay, now I know what this author of this essay wanted me to think. and make sure that the reader knows what your viewpoint is by the end of the first paragraph. And then repeat it in the last paragraph, because this is not a mystery novel. You don't want the reader wondering where you're going. This is not something to excite them and tantalize them with the mystery, because people have short attention spans. In this case, right, with this essay, the judges will be reading everyone's essay because they have to. But if you were writing, say, for any other venue, you have no guaranteed readers, and people are going to scan that first paragraph. And if they don't already know where you're going with it, they're going to say, I have better things to do with my time than read an essay just so I can find out where the author is going with it. So your first paragraph should be, Congress has, currently a bill to do such and such is pending in Congress. This bill would have harmful consequences of doing such and such, and I will tell you why, or something like that. And then all your subsequent paragraphs are going to explain why that thing you said in your first paragraph is true. And then your final paragraph should remind everyone of what you had just been saying the whole time, so then they have a summary on the way out. The next thing I would say is when you then since you are defending some particular viewpoint of your own, you're definitely going to be opinionated or biased in some fashion, but what you want to at least be able to do is describe other people's views accurately. So this is something Brian Kaplan, professor of economics, calls the ideological Turing test. The Turing test is that an artificial intelligence someday will be able to convincingly pass as if it were a human. If you're talking to an AI and you legitimately can't tell that it's not a human, it has passed the Turing test. The ideological Turing test is that when you are describing someone else's view, you should be describing it well enough that someone who actually believes that view would say, yes, that is an accurate representation of my view. So you should be able to do that so that then when you argue why that viewpoint is wrong and you're correct, your opponents don't say, well, you didn't even describe my view correctly. That's not even what I believe. You just knocked down a straw man. And finally, the third thing I would say is when considering sources, like your choice of source, of course, is going to depend on what your argument is. So like if you are, let's say, making an argument about based on things that have happened in the news, well, your sources are probably going to be a lot of news articles, for example. And that's just kind of the nature, if that's the nature of your argument. If you're arguing about something in the courts, well, then you're kind of going to rely on more court cases. So the sources will vary, but what I would say is whatever sources you use, just pay attention to what kind of person is writing them and just take into account what biases they may or may not have. Like every source is going to have some bias. There's no person on earth who writes without any kind of bias whatsoever. So you just want to think of what kind of person is this? What kinds of biases could they have? So let's say, for example, if you cite an article by someone at the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank, perfectly good source, you just want to remember, okay, this author is obviously a libertarian or some sort of free marketer because they wrote for the Cato Institute. Just keep that in mind and realize this person does have some definite viewpoint of their own and weigh that against whatever argument you're trying to make. And if you're only citing people who agree with you, maybe you at least want to think about, is there a reason maybe you should be citing other people too? But maybe not. Maybe it might very well be that the people who have written the most convincing articles do all agree with you. But you at least want to keep that in mind and try to see I think once you acknowledge that, you'll be able to do a better job of evaluating the reliability of the sources. That's what I have.
Got it.
Okay, good.
You could kind of tell I'm the senior member of the group. But anyway, yeah, so I thought, first of all, I wanted to emphasize a couple of things I heard my colleagues say that I thought are worth reinforcing. Understanding your opponent's arguments and making sure to include those in the paper in a way that is sympathetic and tries to show respect for those who disagree with you. I think that's very important. If you write some kind of editorial, like you're trying to win points or score points, and you're on some afternoon talk show or something like that, or political radio show, you can write some really great stuff that'll get people fired up, and it won't have a chance. So we're looking for a kind of cool, calm, academic argument. Okay. I'm sure we're all capable of doing that. It just begins by respecting other points of view, which is really what this topic is all about, right? Can we actually engage in public discourse in a way that promotes communication, and does the government actually need to be involved, or can we ourselves regulate our speech and so forth? My conversations, the other thing I wanted to emphasize that my colleagues talked about is your sources. Just make sure that you choose your sources wisely. Most of the stuff that's online that's going to show up on the front page of any search that you do are editorials, and those editorials are not necessarily academic, not fair. So just be careful about your sources and try and get some from different viewpoints. Okay, now most of the time when I talk to students about this particular topic, their problem is not how do I write this up, but really how do I even think about this, or what does the topic mean, or how do I even get started? So that's kind of what I want to do with my time. I want to talk to you a little bit about the topic itself. So I'm going to try and share my screen again. Let's see if I can do it this time. Okay, looks like I'm going to have a hard time sharing it. Am I still in the meeting?
Yeah, you're still here. We did see your screen briefly.
Okay.
Right at the beginning of your talk. Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
And of course, it's in the wrong window. Okay. So this is my screen. All right, little background. You can't get people that are more diametrically opposed politically than the governors of California and Florida, Newsom and DeSantis, but both of them have come out in favor of a stronger government role in regulating social media content moderation. So neither one of them are happy, and this kind of reflects the mood and the reason why you get some really strange bipartisan support for expanding the role of government in social media. On the left, people are worried about fake news. They're trying to control what you can say about COVID, what you can say about masks, what you can say about climate change and so forth. And, on the right, they're concerned that conservative voices are being eliminated, blocked, shut out. And so, either way, they're both saying we need to turn to government to set some rules of the road to make sure that this potentially very useful public square is open and accessible to all under basic rules of civility. So if you're going to do this, you quickly find that there's a particular part of American law that is under attack. And that is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So this is just a clue. If you don't know where to start, you might want to, use a few search terms. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act protects third parties from things that are said on their platform by other people. So you say something crazy on Facebook, Section 230 is basically designed to protect Facebook from lawsuits and other complaints about what you put on there. Basically, the only thing that Facebook legally has to moderate in terms of content is stuff that, you know, is criminal in nature and you know, leads to an increase in criminal activity. But if it's a matter of opinion, even if it's misinformation, personal attacks, and so forth, legally, they're protected by this Communications Decency Act. And there are many people that want to change that now. They want social media companies to take more responsibility for what you and I choose to post on their platforms. And this isn't just politicians who are asking for this. The social media companies themselves are requesting that government take a larger role. Here's testimony from Zuckerberg, Facebook's founder. We believe Congress should consider making platforms intermediate library protection. Well, you can read the quote here. I violated one of my own principles and put too much content on a PowerPoint slide. But basically, he's saying that government needs to create a transparent rule that all social media platforms need to follow. It needs to be transparent. And he also says it needs to be overseen by certain government agencies. And that depends on who's running those agencies, what kind of approach they might take. So it's kind of strange that the companies themselves want to be regulated, or at least some of them do. And politicians are taking them up on it. And you can see in this abstract map of the United States, there's been legislation to control social media content or their moderation policies in most states. These yellow states are considering legislation right now. Some of them have already enacted laws. And you know, these laws may have been introduced by conservatives, and they may have been introduced by progressives, but they're getting bipartisan support. In general, they're opposed by libertarians. Here's an example of a bill that's been introduced at the federal level. And you might want, if you don't know where to start, you might want to type in something about the PACT Act and the debate surrounding the PACT Act. And it's basically a way of putting into practice what Zuckerberg had requested, right? A process for removing content that violates policies. Anyway, it's all about here's how social media needs to moderate its content. Now, Europe has gone much farther than the United States in this direction. They have already passed their legislation. So if you want to know a little bit about what such a law might look like, what its opponents and proponents think about a law like this, you might want to do some research on the European Union Digital Services Act, right? Here's a quote about the act from the head of the European Commission, what she thinks it will accomplish for consumers. Their approach is basically, this is just basic consumer protection. We don't want consumers to be manipulated by lies. We don't want elections to be swayed by misinformation. We just want to make sure that, you know, the information that's out there is being moderated in a transparent way. And the last line here is kind of interesting. She says, the bigger the social media platform, the more its responsibility for moderating content. So that's an interesting principle you might want to consider. Oops. The Supreme Court is getting into the act. The Supreme Court is hearing cases right now about you know, whether, for example, Google and its ownership of YouTube, whether Google's algorithms are helping terrorists by, you know, feeding into their suggestions things that might be helpful to people attempting to perform terrorist acts. You know, are the platforms protected from that kind of lawsuit, or are they liable? So these cases could go a long way to deciding this issue. So put yourself in the position of a Supreme Court justice in your essay. How would you decide on this? Is YouTube responsible? Are its algorithms responsible? Should its algorithms be changed in a way so that when people start searching in certain areas, those searches should be, diverted into something a little more moderate? And then finally, we shouldn't forget the context in which this debate is happening. There is a resurgence of antitrust activism in the United States, and it gained a lot of momentum with the election of Biden and his appointments to key roles in the government. So this is a picture of Lena Khan. She's the head of the Federal Trade Commission. Under certain legislation that's been proposed, it's her commission that would set up the rules by which social media has to be regulated. And she is a huge anti-big tech activist. Since she took office, she's brought lawsuits against Apple, against Amazon, against Facebook. This is the most activist antitrust legislation, antitrust regulation that we've seen in decades. And it's very much targeting social media. She would like to break those companies up. So that provides a little bit of the context for this debate. It also explains why social media might prefer to be regulated by government rather than broken up by government, right? So in any case, that's what I have to say as far as where to start. Maybe those are some hints. If you're not sure what the topic really means or why it's important, I'm going to shut up now so that we can get to your questions. And I'll turn it back over to Michael Van Beek to moderate those.
Thanks, Dale. That was great. Thanks to all the panelists. I hope that was helpful for the attendees. I don't think we have any questions yet. So attendees, if you have some, just hit that Q&A button at the bottom and type them in there. Since they don't have any proposed right now, I'll ask some of my own to dig a little deeper maybe. I'm wondering, so I think everyone kind of touched a little bit on the importance of good sources. Charlie, you talked about Google Scholar. I'm wondering if you can provide a little more, if anyone can provide a little more on how to really differentiate between a good source and a bad source, and something that's really biased in one way versus something that's presenting more of a balanced approach and should be more trusted.
One thing I would say is if you can figure out who the author is and where they work, the more they work for what sounds like a reputable organization, probably the more reputable that author is. And if what they're claiming to present is their own opinion, you should at least be able to figure out, well, is this person at least a professional who presumably got like some sort of education and presumably is like trustworthy enough. So let's say, if, for example, if something is written, let's say even by an ideological think tank by someone who also has like a master's degree or a PhD or also works as a university professor, well, probably, hopefully, that person, to get their degree or to be a professor or whatever, they must have just had enough academic skill. So that's probably a relatively trustworthy person. You still want to take into account, okay, well, they're being published by this ideological think tank. They probably still have, a strong partisan opinion, but at least, okay, they're still, they at least pass some sort of threshold of reputability. If what you're relying on, let's say, is news articles, well, then you should probably be able to find multiple people from different news sites all saying the same thing. If you found a news article that says something that no other news article says, that's a question, right? So if you find something on Fox News and you're trying, though, to just establish basic facts, well, probably CNN agrees on the same facts, too. If Congressman so-and-so said such and such, hopefully both news sites report the same thing. If they don't, there's a big question.
Charlie or Dale, do you have anything to add? Make sure you unmute yourself.
Sure, I will comment. One resource that I like to use for finding sources that are a little bit more scholarly is if you check with your university, so Northwood University, or even your high school, these educational institutions will purchase access to various platforms that offer access to scholarly sources without charge. I know sometimes when you're trying to look at scholarly sources and studies, you will be able to read the abstract or a section of it before you're asked to pay for a subscription, which can be a huge limitation. So I would recommend exploring what Northwood has to offer. Northwood has access to several of these sites as well, and I know high schools do as well. So I would check with your library to see what resources they have available to you as students that can get you through that paywall that is sometimes associated with higher caliber sources.
So that was an excellent point, Charlie. And the point that you made earlier about looking for your sources, I also think is a great thing, very useful thing. So let's suppose you find an editorial in a obviously biased source. That's okay. Your biased source may be drawing on other sources for their arguments and their evidence. Go back to the primary sources that they used. And a lot of times you can find out a lot that way. So I think those are both good ideas. So if you missed that point the first time, I highly recommend use your sources.
Let me add, so on that note, things like, for example, Wikipedia can be extremely useful. You don't want to rely on them because you don't know who wrote it. But on the other hand, things like that can be great for just figuring out what is even out there. Like if you read a Wikipedia article, at least now you know what are the keywords to look for. Or you can look at the sources at the bottom of the Wikipedia article, probably cite sources. But even if it doesn't, I find even just knowing what are the keywords I'm looking for, right? So if you didn't even know, let's say it's something about the Communications Act. If you don't know when that was passed or who was even involved, you can read the Wikipedia article. Okay, now you know what to search for, and you can probably find a more reputable source that says the same things, but with an actual author and like institution behind it.
Right, absolutely. Thanks for that. We got a question from one of the attendees, and it's about how to make your piece, even though it's going to be opinionated and state a clear opinion. How do you make it not one-sided? So everyone sort of touched on that a little bit as well. So maybe just elaborate more on how you can write this essay that has a clear viewpoint, but do it in a way that makes it that keeps it balanced.
I think in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Mark Antony makes one of the most famous speeches ever, a funeral speech over the grave of Julius Caesar. And he begins by basically saying, you know, my enemies, they did right, or here's why they did what they did, and I can't really. So he starts with great humility. Okay, great humility. And then he gradually introduces, but think about this, but what about this? But do you remember this? So I like when I read the voice of somebody who is acting as if they don't know it all, as if they're a humble investigator and trying to be fair. It's almost a tone of voice or rhetorical style. You definitely give honor and respect to different viewpoints before you tear them down and point out their weaknesses.
I wasn't expecting Shakespeare from you, Dale, but that was right on point. Michael or Charlie, do you have comments on that?
Yeah, what I would say is if you remember that what you're trying to do is persuade someone who disagrees with you. I think, Dale made the point of, this is not a talk show where you're trying to score points. Your goal here is not to have people who agree with you listen to you and say, yeah, he really tore a new one on those other people over there. What you're trying to do is write to someone who disagrees with you and convince them. So if you're trying to convince them, you're probably naturally going to adopt a more moderate tone of voice. And you should try to make arguments that you think they would take seriously. So for example, the question like, why would Mark Zuckerberg be supporting this? Like, one thing that immediately comes to my mind is, I might argue he might be hoping to influence the course of the legislation and help write it in a way that will benefit Facebook by raising barriers to entry to his own competition. For example, by requiring lots of content moderation facilities, it would be harder for some startup to immediately just come into existence out of nowhere and compete with them, because now they'll have to create all this new moderation infrastructure. If I were to make an argument, I might say, let's say to a liberal, you are afraid, for example, of misinformation, but aren't you also afraid of big corporations? Do you really want big corporations to be able to help write legislation that will restrict their own competition? So I would be trying to make an argument that I think that they will take seriously, and that they'll hopefully say, oh wow, I never thought of it, but you're right, that actually is something that's concerning to me.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've heard that it's helpful when you're drafting an opinion piece like this to keep that a person who has a different opinion of you, keep that person in mind as if you're talking to them, because then you will address their strongest points, and that will make your essay even stronger. So, Charlie, did you have anything to add on this particular question?
I think that Mr. McCovey and Mr. Matchek provided excellent explanations. For me, I think I would just prioritize using diplomacy as you are presenting the opposing side and explaining through your research why that side maybe doesn't have as much merit as the argument that you are presenting, as long as you do it with a level of professionalism and sympathy. If you come across as extremely one-sided or extremely fiery, it's ultimately going to degrade the argument, and you're not going to seem as reliable if you put too much emotion in there. So keeping a level of diplomacy and acknowledging it with respect, I think, is important, which is something that Mr. Matchek alluded to earlier.
If I could raise a different point, if there's not a question on
Sure.
the table at the moment, I've served as a judge in these contests in the past. And so I would like to speak a little bit about some of the things that you shouldn't do. Okay, we've been talking a lot about what you should do, I think. But sometimes there's some common tendencies which I want to warn you about. Okay, so first of all, when you use quotations, and you should use quotations, I do find that students sometimes, make a couple of mistakes with a quotation. First of all, they think that when they quote somebody expressing an opinion, that counts as a piece of evidence in their favor. Okay, so somebody agrees with me, right? That's not a strong piece of evidence. If you're using a quote just to demonstrate that, I've got 3 people that agree with me, that's not a strong argument. So don't use quotes as a substitute for good arguments, okay? The second thing I would say about quotes, they can be great if you provide context for the quotes and explain why you're using those quotes. They really fit in with a particular paragraph or idea that you're trying to express. I've seen people use quotes kind of arbitrarily. They'll just stick it in there, but they won't explain what it means or why it's significant, or they'll take it out of context. So make sure that when you use a quote that you provide enough context and that it's really suited to the paragraph in which you've placed it.
Yeah, that's a great reminder about quotes. I've heard it said before too, that you should use a quote only when the author of the quote says something so perfectly that you cannot improve upon it, right? So if you can't put it in your own words because it's just so perfect, then it might be a good quote, which all of that suggests really that you shouldn't rely too much on quotes, which I think is kind of what you're getting at there, Dale. So yeah, that's a good point to remember. I have one other question. I'm wondering about this particular topic is really complex, it seems to me. I mean, it deals with censorship and First Amendment issues, and the First Amendment, deals with speech and religion and assembly and also all sorts of other things. And Dale, you were, bringing up the relevancy of Section 230, of this other act. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for how to keep the essay focused in on the core issue. And I could see that it would be easy to kind of go off and rabbit trails in a variety of directions in writing this essay. So can you offer some advice along those lines?
Well, I'll take a crack on that. So even though this topic is, fairly detailed and, timely, it's definitely, part of the technology that's emerging now that we're using. It's really a timeless topic. And first of all, it's about the role of government in human society, and what can we accomplish through government, and what can we accomplish through voluntary cooperation. So to my mind, it's good to keep in mind that the whole idea about the strengths and weaknesses of using government to try and legislate certain outcomes. I think so. You could talk about that issue on general principle. I think you could point out when government gets involved in censorship, what could possibly go wrong? Not based on what we know about technology today, but based on these historical precedents, for example. I would definitely focus on an approach to this argument, and whether it's a historical approach, whether it's an approach based on principles, whether it's an approach based on, you want to make some consequentialist arguments. Well, here's what will happen if we do this, etc. So I would just try and pick an approach and stick with that approach consistently. You can't do everything in this essay. So I don't know if I made that clear or not, but
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, no, that's clear. That's good advice. Charlie or Michael?
Yeah, what I was going to say is just as long as if you are arguing some specific viewpoint, make sure it is one self-contained argument. You should have, especially depending on since you're writing a short essay and not a book, you have to, or you should be arguing one specific thing. And as long as everything you're saying is leading to that one specific thing, you'll probably do all right. Don't meander off into sidelines. As an aside, though, I just thought of something about quotes to be careful with. I think one good thing that quotes can be used for as well is if you are describing someone else's view and their view sounds so ridiculous, or you think it is such an extreme argument that you want to show that you actually are, like, let's just say, for example, you said something like, liberals want to ban Facebook. Well, that sounds crazy. So you might say, well, as Congressman so-and-so has said, quote, Facebook is an evil corporation, must be stopped. Just to, I completely made that up. But right, if they can be useful for illustrating things that if you didn't have a quote, people would say to you, oh gosh, they've got to be making that up. That can't be true. but the quote should be then either the quote should be self-explanatory or you should be explaining why you quoted it. So in that case, for example, I said, some people want to ban Facebook as so-and-so said. So I'm directly connecting the quote with what I'm trying to do with that quote. No one should wonder, why is that quote there? At the same time, you want to be careful to avoid, sometimes people will try to avoid, let's say you want to steer clear of plagiarism. And so there can be a danger if you, sometimes some people, let's say they'll read an article, it'll have some statement they really like, and they'll say, oh, if I just change one word to a different word, that's not plagiarism. It very easily still can be. If you're taking someone else's quote and changing just one word to make it not plagiarism, it's still plagiarism. Sometimes the rule is set, for example, if you're quoting 3 words of theirs in a row, then without a quotation mark, it's plagiarism. But that's not always true, right? Because what about like the phrase Communications Decency Act? Well, that's 3 words in a row, but it's not, it's not plagiarism. So it's a little bit subjective. But I would say in general, if you have their article open in another tab next to your Word document, and you're carefully looking at their quote and saying, how can I slightly change it so it's not plagiarism, then it's probably plagiarism. And if you're not sure, ask a librarian. Flag if you're writing something down and sometimes I've read quotes from people and I'm like, I'm trying to rephrase this, but I can't think of a way to rephrase it because it's such a simple, basic statement. Like, I don't know, the Atlantic Ocean is east of New York. If someone said that, I have no idea how to phrase that in a way that it's not plagiarism. Like there's no other way in the English language to say that. So if you're not sure, is this plagiarism or not, keep track of your own quotes and ask a librarian and see, but at least keep that in mind.
Good reminder. Charlie, did you have anything to add?
I guess I will revisit the point Mr. Matchek was making just a moment ago, in ensuring that there's so many different facets to this topic of media censorship. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's impossible to cover everything. So I'll reiterate his point that picking a more narrow focus and using that will be to your advantage. I used this as an example earlier, but in my essay last year, I looked at vaccine mandates from a pure historical perspective and looking at the historic application of vaccine mandates, comparing that to today. I didn't try to look at the economy and the impact on business. I kept my perspective very focused and narrow. And I think by having a particular perspective, and also I mentioned this earlier, but using an outline too, to organize those points and really laying out what your perspective is and ensuring that all your points align with that one perspective is going to result in a better quality output that has a focused essay that's relevant to the point you are trying to make, that's going to resonate with the judge.
I would also like to share one more perspective as a judge. Students, I think, sometimes try to anticipate what the judges are looking for. So I want to tell you, as somebody who's been involved in judging the contest, there's no right or wrong answer that we're looking for, really. So we can get 2 winners this year, finalists, who disagree with each other about this particular issue, but they have expressed their opinion, so clearly and with enough support that their argument made an impression, a positive impression, and they changed the way that the reader thinks about this topic in a persuasive way. So don't try and anticipate, oh, I've got to take this opinion and defend it, or I've got to take that opinion and defend it. There's no particular viewpoint we're looking for in the winning essay here. Do your research, try to evaluate it on your own, come to your own conclusions, and present those as best you can. That's what we want.
Great. Well, we are out of time. So I want to say thank you to Charlie, Michael, and Dale for the presentations and the information and the help that you're providing here. To the attendees, you can view this event again or share it with a friend by going to the Mackinac Center's website. That's Mackinac, MACKINAC.org /events, and you'll find this recording there. And then also you can find more information about the essay competition, the Bauervic essay competition at Mackinac's website as well. That's mackinac.org/essay. And then also just a final reminder, again, on Monday, Northwood is hosting an event at 7 p.m. on this issue at Griswold Lecture Hall, where you can get even more information and maybe get the spark of an idea that will become your excellent essay that you'll submit for this competition. So hope to see you at that event. And thank you for attending today. Thank you for your interest in this competition, and best of luck to all of you.